There is a version of this story that ends on the best night of a man's life. On the evening of June 29, 1933, in a suite at the Park Central Hotel in New York City, a heavy-set man of 46 sat with his wife, celebrating their first wedding anniversary. Earlier that same day, he had put his signature on a contract to star in a full-length feature film, his first in nearly 10 years. By every account, he seemed lighter than he had been in a decade, almost boyish, telling anyone who would listen that this was the happiest day of his life. A few hours later, sometime before dawn, his heart gave out while he slept. He never lived to see the comeback he had spent 11 years clawing his way toward. His name was Roscoe Arbuckle, though almost everyone in America knew him simply as Fatty, a nickname he quietly hated for his entire life. And to understand why an ordinary hotel room, an ordinary contract, and a quiet anniversary dinner could mean so much to one man, you have to travel back to a single weekend in the autumn of 1921. To understand how far Roscoe Arbuckle fell, you first have to understand how improbably high he had climbed. He came into the world on March 24, 1887, in the small town of Smith Center, Kansas, one of 9 children in a family with little money and, in his case, even less welcome. The story passed down was that he weighed well over 13 pounds at birth. He named the child, half in spite, after a New York senator known for his scandals. Whatever the truth of that family legend, the boy grew up heavy, mocked for his size, and saddled early with a nickname that would follow him all the way to his grave. His mother died when he was still a boy, and his father, who had already drifted out of his life, left him more or less to fend for himself. He worked in hotels for room and board, sweeping floors and running errands. But there was one thing this heavy, unwanted child could do that no one expected. He could move. For all his weight, he was astonishingly light on his feet, graceful in a way that seemed to defy his own body. And he had a sweet, clear singing voice. On amateur stages, in carnivals and vaudeville houses up and down California, audiences discovered the same thing over and over. This enormous young man was a natural performer, funny and nimble and impossible to look away from. By 1913, he had found his way to Mack Sennett's Keystone Studio, the wild breakneck heart of early silent comedy. And there, in front of a hand-cranked camera, everything the world had once used against him became his greatest gift. His size made his falls astonishing. His grace made them beautiful. He could take a tumble that should have shattered bones and land as softly as a dancer. He threw pies and crashed through doorways and somehow made all of it look like pure joy. Audiences adored him. Within a few short years, the unwanted boy from Kansas had become one of the most popular movie stars alive. And he did not climb alone or selfishly. He took a stone-faced vaudeville acrobat named Buster Keaton, handed him his first real part in pictures, and patiently taught him the craft. Paramount had signed him to a contract worth roughly $1 million a year. His round, gentle face was one of the most recognized on the planet. At 34 years old, Roscoe Arbuckle had traveled further from that cold Kansas childhood than anyone could have dreamed. He was exhausted from a punishing schedule, but by any measure the world used, he was standing on top of it all. And then came Labor Day weekend. On Monday, September 5th, 1921, Arbuckle drove north to San Francisco to rest. He checked into the St. Francis Hotel with 2 friends, taking a small block of adjoining rooms. Prohibition was the law of the land, but liquor arrived anyway, as it so often did, and a party gathered. Among the guests who came and went was a 25-year-old actress and model named Virginia Rappe, and a woman she had arrived with named Maud Delmont. What exactly happened over the following hours has been argued about for more than a century. What is not in dispute is this. At some point during the party, Virginia Rapp became violently ill. The hotel doctor was called and concluded she was merely intoxicated, gave her something to quiet her, and told her to sleep it off. For days she remained gravely sick. She was not taken to a hospital until September 8th. On September 9th, 4 days after the party, Virginia Rapp died. The cause of death was peritonitis, brought on by a ruptured bladder. A young woman was dead. And in the days that followed, Maud Delmont went to the authorities with an accusation that would set the entire country on fire. She claimed that Arbuckle had forced Rapp into a bedroom and assaulted her. It was a lurid, sensational story, and it landed in the most dangerous possible place. Because in 1921, a story like this one did not simply reach the public. It was delivered to them at enormous scale by the newspaper empire of William Randolph Hearst. Hearst's papers seized the case and never let go. Roscoe Arbuckle had become, almost overnight, the single most useful villain in America. His round face now appeared beneath words like murder. He was arrested and for a time held without bail on a charge that began as murder and was later reduced to manslaughter. People who knew nothing but the headlines felt certain they knew exactly what kind of man he was. And here the story turns on a detail the headlines rarely lingered on. The woman whose accusation had started all of it, Maud Delmont, was herself a deeply troubled witness, described by some as a professional blackmailer. The prosecution made a revealing decision. They never put Maud Delmont on the witness stand. Her story would not survive cross-examination. The man was tried for a version of events its author never had to defend. What followed was not one trial, but 3. The first began on November 14, 1921. Prosecutors argued that Arbuckle's weight had crushed Rappe and caused her fatal injuries. The defense countered that Rappe had suffered from chronic health problems. After more than 40 hours of deliberation, that first jury came back deadlocked. It was declared a mistrial. The second trial opened in January 1922. This time, Arbuckle's defense grew overconfident. They chose not to put him on the stand at all. Some jurors read that silence as a sign of guilt. Another mistrial. By the time the third trial began, on March 13, 1922, Arbuckle was nearly ruined. His income had evaporated. He was spending an enormous fortune, selling his house and his cars just to keep paying his lawyers. This time, his attorneys held nothing back. They laid the weakness of the entire case bare for the jury to see. On April 12, 1922, the jury left the room and came back in roughly 6 minutes. Not guilty. But the jury did something almost no jury had ever done before. Composing a written statement to hand to the man they had just cleared. They declared that a great injustice had been done to him and that he was entirely innocent and free from all blame. It was, in the language of the law, about as complete a vindication as a human being can receive. For a brief moment, it must have looked like the nightmare was over. Surely now the country would let him return. It did not. Because a verdict is decided in a courtroom, but a reputation is decided somewhere else entirely. Just 6 days after that apology, the newly appointed guardian of Hollywood's morals, Will H. Hayes, banned Roscoe Arbuckle from the screen. The industry that had made millions from his face now needed, above all else, to look clean. And Arbuckle, though a jury had just declared him innocent, made the most convenient possible sacrifice. It helps to understand what the country was like. The early 1920s were a period of deep moral anxiety. Prohibition was in full force, and a growing chorus had begun to view Hollywood as a den of corruption. The Arbuckle case arrived like a match dropped into dry grass. The scandal became a direct catalyst for the creation of the very censorship office that banned him, and the strict production code that governed American films for decades. The ban was quietly lifted that December, but it hardly mattered. Audiences had spent months being told he was a killer. The most bankable comedian in the world had become untouchable because of what a crowd already felt. And so began the second act of Roscoe Arbuckle's life. The long, quiet, grinding work of trying to rebuild a name that the public would not give back. The years immediately after the acquittal were bleak. His defense had left him buried in debt. His marriage to his first wife dissolved. By many accounts, he drank heavily, sinking into the private wreckage, but he did not vanish entirely. And part of the reason was loyalty. Buster Keaton, the young acrobat Arbuckle had once pulled into the movies, never turned his back on him. Keaton signed over a share of the profits from his own production company to help ease his old mentor's finances. He found ways to put Arbuckle to work behind the scenes, giving him story credits and quiet jobs. To work at all, though, Arbuckle had to become someone else. He stepped behind the camera and began directing under a pseudonym, William Goodrich, a name drawn from his own father. Through the middle and later 1920s, hidden behind that borrowed identity, he directed a long string of comedy shorts, guiding other comedians through the very kind of physical humor he had once made famous. He was often skilled at it, and occasionally those who worked with him glimpsed the strain underneath. One young actress who was directed by him later recalled him as gentle but somehow hollowed out, moving through the job like a man who had switched some essential part of himself off since the scandal. It was, in her telling, the portrait of someone who had learned to survive by making himself nearly invisible. The man who had once been the highest-paid comedian in the world was now, in effect, working for wages he could not put his own name to, directing pictures that would never advertise the fact that Fatty Arbuckle had made them. He had gone from a face on 1,000 marquees to a signature no one was allowed to see. And still, he showed up, day after day, and did the work. The question that hung over all of it was simple and cruel. Would America ever be willing to see his real face again? And laugh? For most of a decade, the answer seemed to be no. And then, slowly, something began to shift. The scandal was aging. A new decade had arrived, bringing sound to the movies and fresh faces to the screen. Among his friends in the industry, a quiet effort took shape. A letter-writing campaign, an argument made person to person that Roscoe Arbuckle had suffered long enough, that a man cleared by a jury deserved to earn his living again. And in 1932, more than 10 years after the party at the St. Francis Hotel, that argument finally found a listener. Warner Brothers decided to take the risk. They signed Arbuckle to appear under his own name, his real name at last, no longer hidden behind William Goodrich, in a series of short sound comedies filmed at the Vitaphone Studios in Brooklyn, New York. For the first time, audiences would not only see Roscoe Arbuckle again, they would finally hear him. Those Vitaphone shorts are the only recordings of his voice that exist. A warm, pleasant tenor, playing grocers and gentle everyman figures. People came, people laughed. It seemed that the country might finally be ready to let him back in. Even then, the old wound had not fully closed. When Warner Brothers tried to release one of the shorts in the United Kingdom, British censors pointed to the decade-old scandal and refused to grant it a certificate. And yet, by the summer of 1933, it truly seemed that Roscoe Arbuckle had done the impossible. He had climbed all the way back. He finished shooting the last of the short films on June 28, 1933. The very next day, Warner Brothers offered him a contract to star in a full-length feature film under his own name. After 11 years of borrowed names and closed doors and quiet humiliations, the comeback was no longer a hope. It was signed. Friends said he was overjoyed, almost disbelieving, moving through that day as though a weight he had carried since 1921 had finally lifted off his shoulders. He reportedly told those around him that it was the best day of his life. That evening, he celebrated his anniversary, spent time with friends, and returned to his hotel late. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, in his sleep, his heart stopped. He was 46 years old. He died on the very day he had reclaimed everything, and he never lived to make the film that would have proven the reclaiming real. There is a temptation to tell this story as a simple tragedy and to leave it there. But it asks something more of us than sorrow. Consider what actually happened to Roscoe Arbuckle. A jury of 12 people concluded he was innocent, and it changed almost nothing. For more than a decade, the verdict of the courtroom lost again and again to the verdict of the crowd. His story raises a question that has not grown any less relevant. What is a reputation really, and who controls it? Arbuckle discovered that a name is not something you own. It is something the public holds on your behalf. And yet, his life is not only a warning. There is something in it that quietly resists despair. Because he did, in the end, almost make it back. Through years of stubborn, unglamorous work. The comeback was real. Audiences did laugh again. The door he had been pushing against for 11 years finally opened. That it opened on the last day of his life is the cruelest possible timing, but it does not erase the fact that it opened at all. Which leaves the rest of us holding the question he never got to answer for himself. If he had lived, would America have fully forgiven him? Would the feature film have been made? Or would the shadow have followed him, no matter how high he climbed? We will never know. And perhaps that uncertainty is the truest ending his story could have. Roscoe Arbuckle died at the exact moment the world finally seemed to be listening. Whether he had truly won it back is something you are left to decide for yourself. So here is what is worth sitting with. When we are certain we know who someone is, how often are we actually looking at the person? And how often only at the version of them we have already agreed to believe? Arbuckle's entire life after 1921 was lived in the gap between those two things. If his story stays with you, think about who else might be living in that same gap right now. Because these are the stories that are easiest to get wrong. Somewhere off the coast of California, his ashes were scattered into the Pacific, returned quietly to the state that had given him both his greatest triumphs and his deepest wounds. No headline marked the spot. After a life lived so loudly and so publicly, in the end there was only the water and the silence, and a name that the world is still, all these years later, quietly trying to decide what to do with.